The secure line in Beijing rang at 3:17 a.m. local time. General Secretary Xi Jinping was awoken by his national security advisor, a man who had never in 15 years of service called the Chinese leader in the middle of the night unless the world was about to catch fire. Comrade Xi, you need to see this immediately. The Americans have crossed a line we didn't think they would cross. What line? They're not just taking Venezuela's oil, they're systematically targeting every Chinese partner in Latin America. This isn't about drugs or democracy, this is about us. Halfway around the world in Washington, D.C., Donald Trump was holding what he called his Western Hemisphere War Council, a meeting that would redefine the global balance of power and drag two nuclear superpowers toward a collision neither could afford. I've spent 30 years studying great power competition. I've watched the Soviet Union collapse under American pressure. I've analyzed China's rise as it challenged Western dominance. But I've never witnessed the moment when two superpowers abandon all pretense of diplomatic cooperation and embrace open economic warfare for control of an entire hemisphere. That moment was happening right now. As Chinese satellites tracked American naval movements in the Caribbean and as American intelligence agencies intercepted increasingly frantic communications between Beijing and its Latin American partners, the world was splitting into two armed camps faster than anyone thought possible. This isn't about Venezuela anymore. This is about whether China will remain a global superpower or become a regional power trapped within Asia by American hemispheric control. The phone call that changed everything. Picture this. At the exact moment Trump was announcing his Venezuelan success to the American people, Xi Jinping was staring at economic reports that made his blood freeze. China had just lost 40% of its Latin American oil supply in a single night. Not through market forces, not through diplomatic pressure, through direct military action that eliminated China's largest energy partner in the Western Hemisphere. But the loss of Venezuelan oil was just the beginning. Within hours of Maduro's capture, American forces had moved to secure Venezuelan ports, where Chinese engineers were building infrastructure projects. Chinese technical advisors were being detained. Chinese cargo ships were being turned away from Venezuelan waters. 20 years of Chinese investment in Venezuela, over $60 billion in loans, infrastructure, and energy partnerships had become worthless overnight. And Trump wasn't finished. Colombia, Cuba, Mexico, he announced to his war council, according to sources who spoke to me on condition of anonymity. Every country in this hemisphere that's been taking Chinese money instead of playing by American rules, we're going to give them a choice, us or them. The Chinese knew exactly what that meant. China's Latin American empire under siege. For 20 years, while America was distracted by wars in the Middle East, China had been quietly building what intelligence analysts called its Southern Strategy, a network of economic partnerships that effectively challenged American dominance in its own backyard. The numbers are staggering. China had become the largest trading partner for most South American countries. Chinese companies controlled major ports in Peru, Brazil, and Argentina. Chinese banks had loaned over $140 billion to Latin American governments. Chinese construction firms were building everything from highways in Bolivia to hydroelectric dams in Ecuador. America had been asleep while China colonized the Western Hemisphere through checkbook diplomacy. But Trump's Venezuelan operation changed everything. Suddenly, every Latin American leader who had accepted Chinese investment was looking at American aircraft carriers and asking themselves a terrifying question. Am I next? And in Beijing, Xi Jinping was asking an even more terrifying question. Can we defend our partners against American military action? The answer was becoming brutally clear. No. Inside the Beijing crisis room, sources close to Chinese leadership, people whose names I cannot reveal without getting them executed, describe a level of panic in Beijing that outsiders never witness. For the first time since the Korean War, China was facing the possibility of direct military confrontation with the United States, not over Taiwan, not over the South China Sea, over control of Latin America. Xi Jinping convened an emergency Politburo meeting that lasted 18 hours. The question on the table, how far was China willing to go to defend its Latin American investments? Military advisors presented options that ranged from economic retaliation to naval confrontation. Defense Minister Dong Jun argued that China should position naval assets in the Caribbean to protect Chinese citizens and investments. The room fell silent. Everyone understood what that meant. Chinese warships in the Caribbean would trigger the first direct military confrontation between China and America since World War II. Foreign Minister Wang Yi advocated for a different approach. We cannot match American military power in their hemisphere, but we can make their expansion so economically costly that they abandon it. Economic warfare instead of military confrontation. But even that strategy had devastating implications. China would essentially be acknowledging that Latin America was America's sphere of influence, surrendering 20 years of strategic investment to avoid military confrontation. For the first time since 1949, China was being forced to retreat. Colombia, the first domino. While Chinese leaders debated their response, Trump was already moving to the next phase of his hemispheric consolidation. Colombian President Gustavo Petro had made the fatal mistake of publicly condemning the Venezuelan operation. Worse, from Trump's perspective, Colombia had been one of China's most important Latin American partners, accepting over $15 billion in Chinese investment and allowing Chinese companies to build critical infrastructure. Trump's response was swift and brutal. Colombia is very sick too, he announced to reporters, run by a sick man who likes making cocaine and selling it to the United States, and he's not going to be doing it very long. When asked directly whether the U.S. would conduct a military operation in Colombia, Trump's answer sent shockwaves through Beijing. It sounds good to me. Within hours, American naval assets were repositioning toward Colombian waters. Not to invade, not yet, but to send an unmistakable message: cooperate with America or face the Venezuelan treatment. China's response was telling: silence. No diplomatic protests, no naval movements, no economic threats. Beijing was abandoning its Colombian partners in real time, cutting losses rather than risk confrontation. The Chinese retreat had begun. Mexico, the ultimate test. But Mexico represented a different level of challenge entirely. Mexico wasn't just another Chinese partner, it was America's largest trading partner and most important neighbor. If Trump could force Mexico to choose between American partnership and Chinese investment, it would represent the complete Chinese economic expulsion from North America. Trump's threats were typically blunt. Something's going to have to be done with Mexico. They're not running their country. The cartels are running Mexico. We could be politically correct and be nice, but we have to do something. But Mexico also represented China's last stand. Chinese President Xi Jinping placed a personal call to Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum, the first time a Chinese leader had directly intervened in Latin American politics since the Cold War. The conversation, according to diplomatic sources, was stark. If Mexico abandons its partnerships with China under American pressure, Xi reportedly said, it signals to the world that China cannot protect its friends. That is unacceptable. Two nuclear superpowers were using Mexico as a proxy for global dominance. The Cuban calculation. Cuba represented an even more complex challenge for both superpowers. For China, Cuba was both an ideological ally and a strategic foothold, just 90 miles from American territory. Chinese investment in Cuban infrastructure and Chinese military cooperation with Cuban forces represented one of the few remaining challenges to complete American hemispheric control. For America, Cuba was unfinished business, the one country in the hemisphere that had successfully resisted American domination for 60 years. Trump's assessment was characteristically direct. Cuba is ready to fall. They got all of their income from Venezuela, from the Venezuelan oil. They're not getting any of it. Cuba literally is ready to fall. But would China let Cuba fall? Intelligence sources suggest that Beijing faced an impossible choice: commit military resources to defending Cuba and risk direct confrontation with America, or abandon its most strategically positioned ally in the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese decision revealed everything about the new global balance of power. China chose retreat, the great abandonment. What happened next will be studied in international relations classes for decades, the fastest strategic retreat by a major power in modern history. Within 72 hours of Trump's Mexican and Cuban threats, China began quietly withdrawing technical advisors, canceling infrastructure projects, and redirecting investment away from Latin America. Not because Chinese projects weren't profitable, many were extremely successful. Not because Latin American countries wanted to end their Chinese partnerships, most preferred Chinese investment to American interference. Because China realized it couldn't defend its Latin American partners against American military action. The message was clear. Any Latin American country that maintained significant Chinese partnerships risked the Venezuelan treatment, and China couldn't stop it. For the first time since the Korean War, China was acknowledging American superiority in direct great power competition. The retreat wasn't just strategic, it was psychological. America's strategic master stroke. From Trump's perspective, the Latin American campaign represented the most successful geopolitical operation since the end of the Cold War. Without fighting a major war, without significant American casualties, without massive military expenditure, America had achieved something that decades of diplomacy couldn't accomplish: the complete expulsion of Chinese influence from the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela's oil resources under American control. Colombia's strategic position aligned with American interests. Mexico's economic partnerships reoriented toward American priorities. Cuba's survival dependent on American tolerance. China's 20-year strategy for challenging American hemispheric dominance completely neutralized. But the real victory wasn't military, it was demonstrative. Trump had proven that America could simply take what it needed from smaller countries without meaningful Chinese resistance. Every country in Asia was now doing the math. If China couldn't protect its partners in Latin America, could it protect its partners anywhere? The psychological warfare. What made Trump's strategy particularly effective was its psychological dimension. It forced China to choose between military confrontation and global humiliation. Military confrontation meant risking nuclear war over countries that, while strategically important, weren't essential to Chinese survival. But retreat meant acknowledging that America could challenge Chinese interests anywhere in the world without fear of meaningful retaliation. Chinese leadership chose humiliation over annihilation, a rational choice, but one with devastating long-term implications for Chinese global credibility. Every potential Chinese partner was now wondering, if Beijing won't defend its interests in Latin America, will it defend them anywhere? The psychological impact extended beyond Latin America. Countries across Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia were recalculating their relationships with China based on Beijing's failure to respond to American pressure in Venezuela. China's Global Belt and Road Initiative, the centerpiece of its challenge to American global dominance, was losing credibility in real time. The dominoes falling. Within weeks of China's Latin American retreat, the global realignment was accelerating beyond anyone's predictions. Countries that had been moving toward Chinese partnership began reversing course. Infrastructure projects were canceled, trade agreements were renegotiated, military cooperation arrangements were quietly terminated. Not because these countries preferred American partnership, but because they feared American retaliation. The message was unmistakable. In a world where America was willing to use military force to maintain hemispheric dominance, alignment with China was simply too risky. From Africa to Southeast Asia, Chinese diplomats were finding doors that had been open for decades suddenly closed. Chinese companies were losing contracts they'd spent years negotiating. Chinese banks were seeing loan agreements canceled by governments afraid of American pressure. China's global expansion had hit an American wall. The new rules of great power competition. What emerged from the Latin American crisis was a new understanding of how great power competition works in the 21st century. The old rules assumed that both superpowers would respect certain boundaries, that neither would use direct military force to challenge the other's sphere of influence. Trump had rewritten those rules. The new American doctrine was simple. Any Chinese partner anywhere in the world was a potential target for American action if their cooperation with China threatened American interests. Geography still mattered, but American military reach made geography less protective than ever before. Countries had to choose: align with America and accept American protection, or align with China and risk American retaliation. For most countries, it wasn't really a choice. The cliffhanger that reshapes everything. As I write this, Chinese President Xi Jinping is facing the most serious challenge to his leadership since taking power. The party faithful are asking uncomfortable questions about how China allowed America to completely neutralize its Latin American strategy without meaningful resistance. But Beijing's retreat from Latin America is just the beginning. Trump has proven that American military superiority can override Chinese economic influence anywhere in the world. The methodology that worked in Venezuela can work in Africa, Central Asia, or Southeast Asia. China's choice is becoming stark: accept American global dominance or risk military confrontation that could destroy both civilizations. But Xi Jinping is not Maduro. China is not Venezuela, and the next phase of this confrontation will determine whether we're witnessing the peaceful resolution of great power competition or the opening moves of World War III. Because if China won't defend its partners abroad, it will eventually have to defend its interests at home. And Taiwan, the island that China considers a core territorial interest, is starting to look like it might be Trump's next target. The Latin American crisis was just the opening round. The main event is coming, and this time, China might not retreat.